Project was started in 2018. First, we were just an Amazon Alexa skill, then a podcast. Social media posting followed, and then a WhatsApp group. Today in Jewish History gets over 30,000 monthly consumptions, and now it's time to bring it into book form. The cost of bringing a Jewish book to publication is quite a significant one. That's why if you ever look at the beginning of any Jewish book, there's many dedications and sponsorships because the costs are tremendous to make a book happen. We are now bringing the money together to bring Today Jewish History into book form, and I hope that we can count on your sponsorship. Please consider sponsoring one day on the Jewish calendar for $180, or maybe an entire month for $1,800. I look forward to having you work with me on this project to inspire people around the world with the timeless lessons of Jewish history. Good evening and welcome to our last installment of the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and just in case you don't make it to the end of tonight's lecture, don't worry. Even though we have reached modern times here in the Jewish Destiny series, in the coming weeks we'll be starting a brand new series called the Jewish Personality series, or the Jewish Profile series, still deciding on the marketing exactly, where we will focus on great Jewish personalities throughout Jewish history. So don't worry, we're still going to have our Wednesday night live stream, and then you'll be able to grab the reruns off of Torah Anytime at your own convenience. So we'll still be studying Jewish history together on a weekly basis. But for tonight, we're going to conclude the Jewish Destiny series and cover the last few decades up until modern times. As I always say, once we're talking about times when I was alive, it's not really history, but we'll go through some of this quickly just to give the final stamp on our story of Jewish history that we've been discussing together over the past 77 weeks or so. So at the end of the tumultuous first few decades of the state of Israel, we had a situation where Egypt and Syria had started off as Russian vassal states, and essentially much of the conflict in the Middle East was really just a proxy war of the Cold War. Before the 73 war, and definitely in the aftermath of the 73 Yom Kippur War, Sadat made it clear that he wanted Egypt out of the Russian sphere into the Western sphere of influence, and that was really his goal. He kicked out the Russian advisors before the Yom Kippur War. After the Yom Kippur War, in the aftermath, when he came to Jerusalem, Camp David Accords, signed the peace deal with Begin, his relationship with Jimmy Carter, it was clear that he wanted to put Egypt firmly in the sphere of influence of the West and out of the sphere of the Soviets, which was a great destabilizing action for the Soviets because Egypt was the biggest of the Arab countries, and if they lost Egypt, they really lost their influence in the Middle East. And much of the other smaller proxy wars of the Cold War were a result of Russia just really trying to have a foothold in the Middle East. Everything we saw in Afghanistan, etc., was really just Russia still trying to have an influence somewhere in the Middle East. Now, when we look at the peace deal signed between Israel and Egypt, it ended up being a good deal for both Israel and Egypt, even though it was very hard fought by Begin, hard fought by Sadat. In the end, Carter had to come in and put his own spin on things. But the amazing thing is that both sides have really continued to live up to the peace deal that was signed in 1977, more than 4 decades now, right? 4.5 decades. Now, as we know what happened, sort of the depressing, not the end of the story, but the depressing chapter in that story was that in Sadat's signing of a peace deal with Israel, he was the first to violate the three no's of the Arab world, right? No recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel. He violated all three. He recognized Israel, he made peace with Israel, and to get there, he negotiated with Israel. So because of that, he paid with his life. And he was assassinated. Interestingly enough, it was an annual parade that had been held since 73, where Egypt was celebrating their reconquest, if you will, of the Suez, even though it didn't really hold, because even after 73, they conquered the Suez and lost it again in the same war. But be it as it may, they would make as we said, I think last week, is the Arabs remember the beginning of the Yom Kippur War and the Jews remember the end. So the victory parade, so to speak, was celebrating the beginning of the Yom Kippur War, and celebrating that at least after 77, or it was a process after 77, but after the Camp David Accords, the Suez and the Sinai did come back into control of Egypt. And so it was an annual parade that they had on October 6, 1981. Sadat was there in the viewing booth of the military parade. It was actually shot by part of the military. An officer by the name of Islambuli unloaded his assault rifle into the parading grounds where Sadat was, and to Sadat. Sadat was killed. The Cuban ambassador was killed. An Omani general, a Coptic Orthodox bishop, the head of the Egyptian Central Auditing Agency, and all. There were a number killed. There were 28 wounded. Included in those who were wounded was the vice president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak. And also there was an Irish defense minister by the name of James Tully, and 4 U.S. military liaisons. So many people were injured or killed at that time with the goal being to take down Sadat, and they did. Now, even though Mubarak was injured in that attack, he did survive, and he was appointed or became president because he had been vice president, and he subsequently became the longest ruling Egyptian president, ruling from that time in 81 until roughly around the time of his death in 2010, and there was a question if he was going to maintain the Camp David Accords or not. But interestingly enough, he was able to bring the country back under a certain amount of calm after this attempt, and he ruled for a very long time, in many ways keeping a lot of the policies of Sadat in place, and he pretty much kept to the agreement of he kept to the agreement of the Camp David Accords. So through Mubarak's reign, the peace between Egypt and Israel existed, and even since Mubarak's death, even though there was that short time period when the Muslim Brotherhood gained control and we all got nervous, for the most part, Egypt has continued to recognize this peace, remarkably so. And that's what happened with Egypt, and that's how Egypt has played forward until today. Now, the big issue really after the Yom Kippur War, after the 67 War was Judea and Samaria, because we had the three different swaths of land that were gained in that war, in the 67 War. One was the Sinai, went back to Egypt. One was the Golan Heights. There's really not as we would say in Talmudic terms, a havamina on the part of Israel to get back the Golan Heights, even though Syria has always said it's a prerequisite for peace. Syria thinks because they were there for 19 years, somehow it's theirs. It's a funny thing. But we know that it's a military high ground. It's a strategic position. We'd be crazy to give it back. And Israel's annexed it. It was annexed by Israel. Trump actually finally recognized that annexation. So America's recognized that annexation. Biden has not gone back on it. So Golan is firmly part of Israel at this point. And if it was even a discussion with Syria, it's no longer disputed territory, even according to UN standards. So, all right. Well, who knows according to UN standards, but at least according to America and according to Israel, it's not disputed territory. It is firmly part of Israel. But the big question is Judea and Samaria, because while there are parts of Judea and Samaria that were annexed right away by Israel, like East Jerusalem, for example, the old city of Jerusalem, Ma'ale Adumim, Hebron, different things are firmly part of Israel, but other parts are not. And that's always sort of been held with this concept of land for peace. The thing that's made that very complicated is the unilateral settlements built by Israel. What are quote unquote the settlements. And a lot of the motivation for this is really just the idea that biblically Judea and Samaria was part of Israel. This was part of biblical Israel. This is part of our ancestral homeland. As long as it's disputed and sort of no man's land as far as an international sense, let's take and make it Jewish. And it's largely motivated through the religious Zionist movement. And to that end, there's about 500,000 people now living in Judea and Samaria, in a total of about 250 different communities, including my daughter and son-in-law who live in Beitar, which is a Haredi neighborhood within the West Bank, within Judea and Samaria. But that makes the whole discussion of land for peace very difficult, because now out of the roughly 7 million Israelis, you got about 500,000 of them living in this area, and in order to have any kind of land for peace, well, what's been made pretty darn clear is, even though land for peace has never really worked. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say that. It worked with Egypt, kind of has worked with Jordan, sort of. But what do you do with these 500,000 people? You can't just tell them to leave. When they told the quote unquote settlers in the Sinai they had to leave, that was very difficult, by the way. It was very, very difficult. They had to be yanked out by Israeli soldiers and Israeli police. But that was not biblical. That was not biblical Israel. With the disengagement of Gaza, also very difficult. That was sort of biblical Israel, but Gaza had always been a sort of a non-Jewish bastion within Israel during the First Temple, during the Second Temple, and on to modern times. But still, there are Jews who lived there and they didn't want to leave. Can you imagine if we had to yank 500,000 Jews out of their homes in Judea and Samaria? Nothing doing. I can't imagine how that would ever be done. So this concept of ever, quote unquote, going back to pre-67 lines, land for peace with Judea and Samaria, as time's gone on and the Arabs have not been willing to make any kind of peace, they kind of like the ship has sailed to a certain extent. So I don't know what the resolution is ever going to be with the Arabs living in Judea and Samaria, because there are still a lot of Arabs living in Judea and Samaria. Because look, we see what happened when we gave Gaza over to self-govern, with Hamas taking over and it being the world's biggest bastion of terrorism. So look, I don't know what the solution is, but it's something that started really in the wake of the 67 war. It's always caused friction between the U.S. and Israel, especially Obama. Obama was always talking about pre-67 borders, always talking about a settlement freeze, more than any other president. But it's not just Obama; it's just about every president of the United States. So it's been an ongoing issue that only gets worse with time. It's like one of those ships that has sailed. I don't know how it's reversible. Just interesting to point out that the biggest builder of these quote-unquote settlements was Ariel Sharon, who has, of course, since passed away, but he was also the prime minister who disengaged from Gaza. So it's just an interesting, twist of history that the one who built all these settlements was the one who ended up giving back Gaza, and really proving that you can't give back the land, because what you end up with is a Gaza controlled by Hamas. So, again, I don't know what the solution is. I do know what the solution is. It's called Mashiach. I think Mashiach has to come, because that's about all that will resolve this issue. Now, one of the other major really turning points for the Western world in general and the Jewish world specifically was in 1979, and that is the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Now, Iran, in the decades leading up to the Islamic Revolution, was actually an ally of Israel. In fact, from the founding of the state until 1979, most of the oil that the state of Israel got was actually from Iran. They had a joint pipeline that they built together, and Iran, under the control of the Shah, the Shah was propped up by the West. He was, as many Arab leaders many Middle Eastern leaders, was completely corrupt. But he was a secular Muslimist, so to speak. He was not like the faction within Iran that was the Shiite faction that wanted Islamic rule, that wanted more Islamic, wanted to be a more Islamic country, and he thought he had that under control. And this was all propped up by the West. Now, one of the things he did to try and really squash the Shiites within Iran, or the more fanatical Shiites, was to make religious studies illegal within the country. Now, what's interesting is during that time, during the 70s, there were you still had a very sizable Jewish community within Iran, and there was a group of Jews from America led by none other than the executive vice president of my yeshiva, Rav Naftali Neuberger, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, from Yeshivas Ner Yisrael, who mounted a movement to lobby the Shah in Iran that he should make a distinction between Islam and Judaism. In other words, the religious seminaries of Islam had been made illegal, essentially. But with that, the law in the book, so to speak, was religious institutions, religious seminaries. Rabbi Neuberger lobbied that he should make that distinction and allow the Jews to still have religious studies and have yeshivas and whatnot. And to that end, he set up a system where Iranian boys would come to Ner Yisrael in Baltimore and learn how to learn Torah, become Talmudic scholars, become rabbis. They would then be sent back to Iran to educate the Iranian community and to be able to make the Iranian community, the Iranian Jewish community, an educated Jewish community. This was the plan that Rabbi Neuberger was successfully set up in the 70s, and really up until the Islamic Revolution, swaths, probably tens up to hundreds of Iranians came from Iran to study in Yeshivas Ner Yisrael, with the goal being that they would go back to Iran to educate Iranian Jewry. Then the Islamic Revolution breaks out, the Ayatollah takes over, it becomes very clear that the new world order in Iran is going to be very difficult for the Jewish people, and the same inroads that Rabbi Neuberger made to be able to bring students to study in Ner Yisrael in America, and then with the goal being to send back to Iran, well, the first part of that process went into full steam. In other words, Rabbi Neuberger used the inroads that he had made to bring these students to Ner Yisrael to just get as many Iranian Jews out of Iran as he possibly could. And if there's one man that we can really credit with saving Iranian Jewry from the Ayatollah, it was Rabbi Neuberger Zatzal. He really just, it became an obsession almost of his that he had to do what he could to be able to save Iranian Jewry from the Ayatollah. And he was so focused on this that a story is told that 1 year after Yom Kippur, someone comes into his office about an hour after the fast ended, when all the students had gone down to the dining room to break their fast, all the families had gone home to break their fast, and Rabbi Neuberger was sitting in his office, still wearing his kittel and his talis, meaning he'd gone right from Ne'ilah and Mariv into his office, picked up the phone, on the phone dealing with some sort of Iranian Jewry crisis going on in Iran. And so he's really the one we can look to give credit to saving Iranian Jewry. All the Persian Jews that we know now, a lot of them are here on the processes and the plans and the programs that he put into place. Now, initially, after Iran becomes the Islamic Republic of Iran that it is today, it begins a war with Iraq that goes on for, 10 years or so. And it was a very, very bloody war. This was a Shiite-Sunni war because Iraq was a Sunni state, and now Iran was controlled by the Shiites. And it was a very, very bloody war. It killed hundreds of thousands, and in the end, it just ended in a draw. But what it did when it ended, first of all, that it brought a lot of these Soviet weapons into the Middle East, like the Scud missiles that we saw in the Persian Gulf War. And so it really armed these countries that were shown to be really, in many ways, terrorist countries. But once Iran and Iraq, so to speak, ended their draw, Iran was able to develop as the terrorist country that it has become today and turn its wrath really on the West. But, it's kind of hard to attack the West, so they really have proclaimed the destruction of what they see as the puppet of the West in the Middle East, and that is Israel. So this is really the struggle and the issue that we have going on right now with Iran. And if Chas v'Shalom Iran becomes a nuclear country, what this would mean is Iran is set on destroying the West. The goal is to destroy the West. And in part of that, it sees Israel as the proxy of the West in the Middle East, and therefore it wants to start with destroying Israel in hopes that somehow through destroying Israel, or after destroying Israel, they could then move on to destroy the entirety of the West. And that's really the situation we have with Iran, a very difficult situation. I think the idea of negotiating with Iran is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, you talk about, the line I always use with my kids is I don't negotiate with terrorists, and I don't know what America plans to gain out of negotiating with Iran, the country that is proclaimed its goal of destroying the West, that is sponsoring Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, terrorist organizations, and somehow we think we're going to negotiate with them that they're not going to build an atomic bomb and they'll keep their word. Yeah, right. Bring them to their knees, sanction them like crazy, and America should be the strong country that it can be, and not take this concept of leading from the back and thinking that somehow if America sanctions but Guam doesn't, or Guam's a territory of America, if America sanctions but Guatemala doesn't, somehow we'll have problems. No, if America sanctions, Iran will be in trouble, and therefore that's what we should do. Okay, you know how I feel about that. So that's what happens with Iran. Now, We mentioned last week the First Lebanese War, where the First Lebanon War, where the PLO had essentially taken over Lebanon, and finally, when Menachem Begin as prime minister, after his peace deal with Egypt, with Arik Sharon as a part of his, prodded by Ariel Sharon, they decided to try and get rid of the PLO once and for all. The original goal was to go about 15 to 20 miles into Lebanon, make a buffer zone, get rid of the PLO, kill Yasser Arafat. This was all the goal, but it didn't really work like that. They went way too far. They went all the way to Beirut. They put Beirut under siege. This resulted in Israel getting tremendous pressure from the United States to pull out before any goals were really achieved. They ended up having to make an agreement where the PLO was able to leave Lebanon for Tunis. Yasser Arafat was able to leave, even though at certain points he'd been the sights of Israeli snipers. And the PLO lives to breathe another day after the First Lebanon War. Israel withdraws from Lebanon. They leave a buffer zone. That buffer zone is manned by the Christian militias that were their allies during this war. And eventually, as we talked about last week, the Christian president is assassinated, and it's left Lebanon in a state of turmoil really until this day. That turmoil has let Hezbollah, as the Iranian proxy, really use the country as its staging ground for terrorist attacks into Israel. It led eventually to the Second Lebanon War, which again, nothing was achieved. Fighting these terrorist groups, you're not fighting a country, you're not fighting a state, there's no one to overthrow, it's door-to-door combat, it's guerrilla warfare. It's one of these things that you'll win the war, you'll win the war strategically, or you'll win the battle, but you won't gain any kind of, or you'll win the practical war, but you won't gain any kind of strategic gains, because once the terrorists are rearmed, there's always, if you kill 100, there's 1,000 more waiting to sign up. I don't know how you beat it. I just don't know how you beat it. Now, in the 80s, we saw something interesting, an interesting shift in Israel. We mentioned how when Begin comes to power with Likud in 1977, that he did that in part with reaching out to different disenfranchised groups within Israel, most notably the Sephardim. And shortly after that, within a decade, the Sephardim really organized around the chief Sephardic rabbi, Rav Ovadia Yosef, and Zecher Tzadik Levracha, and they are able to create their own political party, known as Shas. Shas it's a play on words, because Shas, when we talk about it in an academic sense, it means the Talmud, but over here it means Shomrei Sfard, meaning the guardians of the Sephardic community, and that was founded in 1984, making the Sephardim within Israel a real force to reckon with within Israel, because so many times before this point in Jewish history, anytime you would have a sort of the collision of Sephardim and Ashkenazim, the Sephardim become Ashkenized, and that's what we saw many times before. After the Spanish expulsion, when Sephardim went to different Ashkenazi countries, they just blended in. They didn't maintain their own communities at all. But one of the things that the development of the Shas party, one of the goals was to make sure that the Sephardic community would have its own cultural presence within the state of Israel, and that they have had until this very day. Now, the subsequent, about 15 years later, you had another ethnic party develop, and that's the Yisrael Beitenu party in 1999, which was a Russian party, because after the fall of Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, you had about 1 million Russian Jews, for the most part, come to the state of Israel, and within a decade they organized into their own political party, and it's a Russian hard-right anti-religious party known Yisrael Beitenu, led today by Avigdor Lieberman, and that was what we saw in this wave of Israeli politics. It started with Shas, and we see it as the Russian party now. And look, as things develop, I'm willing to bet one day you'll have an Ethiopian party within the state of Israel. And now the interesting question will be, at least with Shas and with Yisrael Beitenu, possibly with the Ethiopians as well, as what the next generation is going to look like, because that those cultural distinctions, as much as these parties were started to try and have the cultural distinction, practically once you get to a second and then even a third generation, those cultural distinctions start to fade away, and it'll be interesting to see what happens to those political parties as this continues to happen throughout the generations. In the 80s, in 1987 specifically, you had something called the First Intifada. Intifada means uprising. It was the Arab uprising. At this point, the PLO is the force to reckon with in Israel. They're even though they're technically they're located in Tunisia, their operatives are still very present in Gaza and in the West Bank. And in this uprising, they set out to the goal is it's hard to understand what the goal is. Like the idea of somehow by blowing up a bus they're going to get the Jews to leave Israel, but that's really what the goal is. I mean, that's what the goal of terrorism is. That by random acts of terror you terrorize a whole country, and hopefully you get people to leave. Hopefully you can in the vacuum you can come to power. But that didn't happen in the First Intifada in 1987, which lasted until the Madrid Peace Conference in '91. It didn't happen in the Second Intifada in 2000. It's it's all it's helping to do is make the life for the Palestinians that much more difficult, because now we have the security fence. Now they've tried to build terror. It's like we build the security fence, they build the terror tunnels, we blow up the tunnels. It's just I don't know where it's going to end. I'm just stating facts here without if I knew the resolutions, then I'd be prime minister. But I don't know what it is. But yeah, the First Intifada in '87 and the culmination of the First Intifada in '91 really leads to the Oslo Accords, the debacle known as the Oslo Accords, which comment back that after the Madrid Peace Conference, you have a disciple of Shimon Peres who negotiates clandestinely with the PLO, and that ends up leading to the Oslo Accords, and the Oslo Accords are a very interesting thing because basically what the Oslo Accords say is that the West Bank will be given over to a Palestinian state, and that there will be Palestinian sovereignty and the two-state solution, all these things, and it's one of these ideas that's great on paper, but the only problem was the person that they were negotiating with in the Oslo Accords was none other than Yasser Arafat, Yamach Shemo. Now, by the way, until this point, Israel had never negotiated with Yasser Arafat. They never recognized him as the leader of the Palestinian people, and even America was reluctant to do that. So it was really the left wing, the Labor Party, Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, and whatnot that uplifted Arafat to be the leader, or really made him the recognized leader by negotiating with him, and because of that led to the Oslo Accords, and you have the iconic picture on the White House lawn, which shows Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands with Yasser Arafat, who Rabin looks very reluctant. You have Bill Clinton in the background. Now, what's interesting is they aren't actually the ones who signed the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were signed by their to-be successors, Mahmoud Abbas and Shimon Peres, who are actually the ones who signed the Oslo Accords. Kind of interesting. But the same day, what's interesting is that the same day that Rabin presents the Knesset the Jericho-Gaza agreement, which was the plan to implement the Oslo Accords. The same day, Arafat was speaking at a mosque in Johannesburg, and there he implied that the agreement was only temporary, and it was driven by political expediency. It was just driven so they could see what they could gain. And he compared it to an agreement that Muhammad had made when he was, in his words, when he was trying to take over Mecca, an agreement that he made, a peace agreement supposedly with the Jewish tribes in Mecca, and the agreement was supposed to last 10 years, and 2 years later he comes in and conquers Mecca and wipes out those tribes, and Arafat made it clear that the Oslo Accords were just to see what we can gain, just to save us some time. He still called for jihad, for holy war in Jerusalem, and that was always his goal, and that was his true colors. And it's just crazy how he pulled the wool over the eyes of so many for so long. But the Oslo Accords led to billions of dollars coming into the Palestinian territories that were supposed to lead to infrastructure, to building up the community. Much of that money doesn't ever get down to the people. Arafat never lets an audit of the books. When he died, I think he was the 7th wealthiest world leader because he had taken all that American aid money and essentially just lined his own pockets with it. And the Palestinian state will never come to fruition, and not because of the Israelis. It's because of the Palestinian leadership. The biggest impediment for a better life for the Palestinians from Yasser Arafat until today is the Palestinians, the Palestinian leadership. If the people would ever realize this and try and replace the leadership with some people who actually care about them, maybe they'll get somewhere in this world. In the process of this, we have a couple other events that that shaped the Jewish world. We have the first Iraqi War, where Saddam Hussein says that Kuwait really belongs to Iraq. He invades Kuwait, and George H.W. Bush, that's George Bush the first, tells him, Saddam Hussein, you better get out of Kuwait. And Saddam Hussein didn't listen because he knew his name was Saddam, not Saddam. So he stays in Kuwait. Eventually, Bush puts together a coalition. They go to war against Iraq, and at that time, Iraq can't attack America in any way, but again, they turn their wrath on the one ally that America has in the Middle East, being Israel. They shoot 39 Scud missiles into Israel. Thank God no one is hurt from those Scud missiles, even though it was a tremendous terror for the country. And Saddam Hussein is allowed to keep leading, to keep fighting. It's sort of, if we would look at on a larger level, but it's like World War I. America, defeated Germany, but didn't exactly bring Germany to his knees, didn't change in any way, and then the result was we had World War II. And to a certain extent, that's what we had with Iraq. It didn't bring, we brought Saddam Hussein to his knees to a certain extent, but didn't dethrone him, didn't depose him, and he just came back to fight for more until he was eventually dethroned and hung. Shortly after all this, in October 1994, Israel out of nowhere signs a peace treaty with Jordan. Now this, again, even though Oslo was a debacle, the peace treaty with Jordan actually worked and is actually held until today. Somewhat of a cold peace, but it has lasted until today. So in 1994, you have a situation where Egypt has peace with Israel, Jordan has peace with Israel. You have the Oslo Accords, which we'll see will fall apart in less than a decade. But to a certain extent, it looks like maybe things are happening. Now, Syria, we see we're never going to get anywhere with because they want the Golan Heights back. And as we said before, we're not going to give back the Golan Heights. And, the big, now that Jordan's sort of out of the picture, Egypt's out of the picture, Syria, well, nothing's going to happen with Syria. The question just becomes what to do with the PLO. And the big statement is this two-state solution that was supposed to come about through the Oslo Accords. But again, like we said, the Palestinian leadership doesn't want it. Because if that two-state solution ever comes to be, then they really have to have infrastructure. They really can't blame Israel anymore. They can't blame anyone. The responsibility is going to be on them. As long as they can blame Israel and blame everyone else, they can continue to line their pockets and live the life that they want. And therefore, that's really the saddest thing, because the quote-unquote Palestinian refugees are just pawns to this. They're living a terrible existence in the refugee camps because of the Palestinian leadership, who wants to keep lining their own pockets and doesn't care at all about their people. And that's the truth. Now, Oslo takes an interesting turn when on November 4th, 1995, Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated by a Jew who really his claim was that that Rabin was a traitor. Okay, he was wrong. He was very wrong. But what happens in the wake of this is that anyone who even questions Oslo is considered a traitor. Is considered someone who killed Rabin. So Oslo is able to just barely get through the Knesset. And it goes into implementation, but eventually it just leads, through, after a strange twist of events, leads to the Second Intifada, which will make it clear to the world that Oslo is just not happening, even though there'll be a second attempt by Ehud Barak. But it's clear that it's just, with this incarnation of the PLO, first with the Yasser Arafat, and then with Mahmoud Abbas, because it's really just been more of the same. And for sure, with the split of the Palestinians with Fatah and Hamas, we have a population that there's just no one to talk to. The problem is not Israel. Anyone tells you the problem is Israel, the problem is not Israel. The problem is the Palestinians, and the problem is the Palestinian leadership. And you talk about overthrowing a terrorist leadership, but that's easier said than done sometimes. So I don't know what the resolution is going to be, but it's the prospects in the present stalemate don't look too promising. Now, something interesting happens in the early 2000s. A finance minister comes into power by the name of Benjamin Netanyahu, aka Bibi Netanyahu. Now, Bibi Netanyahu previously had a short stint as prime minister from 96 to 99, but as the finance minister under Sharon, he has the goal of really unleashing Israel from any of the socialist underpinnings that it had since really its foundation in 48 and on up until 2003 when he comes to power. And his goal is to make it a 100% free market economy. And to that extent, he is extremely successful. And that's a lot of the glory that Netanyahu ends up coming, when he becomes prime minister, is the free market economy, the startup nation that Israel is known for today. the credit, and rightfully so in my opinion, is due to Benjamin Netanyahu, because had it not been for him really going into the government and undoing all of the socialist policies that were still in place, a lot of the free market policies that we see today in the startup nation, and the fact that every major high-tech company has a presence now in either Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, the credit to that is due to Netanyahu, and really just started at the beginning of, really after the dot-com bust, but in the, before Internet 2.0, and in everything we've seen today, that's what's positioned Israel to become a real economy of leadership that it is today on the world stage. And then, the situation's just gone on. We have a second Lebanon war, which comes in the wake of when Ehud Barak wanted to try and sign a peace deal with Lebanon. He completely pulled Israel out of Lebanon, abandoning the Christian militia that had allied themselves with Israel all these years. And he was hoping to pave the way to peace with Lebanon, but all it did was pave the way for Hezbollah to come and take over and make Lebanon continue to be a destabilized state that is 100% against Israel. And every time we have one of these wars, the first Lebanon war, the second Lebanon war, the Gaza war, they're wars that, like we said, we can win the battle, but we'll have no strategic gains. It'll leave the Israeli populace often split. It'll make the world more anti-Israel because it'll make the world look at Israel as aggressors. And, it's really a lose-lose situation. And this had really been the tone throughout the 80s, throughout the 90s. We have a cold peace with Egypt, a cold peace with Jordan, ultimately nothing doing with the Arabs. And then all of a sudden, with the most unlikely of American presidents, Donald Trump, everything changes when along the lines of all his just uncanny, inexplicable actions, he appointed a group of Orthodox Jews essentially completely in charge of the Israel question, referring to his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, Avi Berkowitz, David Friedman, the ambassador to Israel, Jason Greenblatt, who is special envoy, Ari Lightstone, etc. All these Orthodox Jews were in charge of essentially America's relationship with Israel, and through a really uncanny twist of events that really been brewing for a long time, many of the more Western-leaning Arab powers saw that one second, that this idea of the three no's, well, okay, it didn't work so well for Sadat, but Egypt's maintained this for a number of decades, and we see that Jordan's maintained it already for half a decade, and maybe we can do something about this. And all of a sudden, you see Arab nations starting to crack. You have the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, all come forward to sign peace deals with sign peace deals with Israel, and I wouldn't be surprised if before too long we see Qatar, we see Saudi Arabia, we see the entirety of the Persian Gulf, because they realize that Israel's not the enemy of the world. Iran's an enemy they have to worry about. And really what it's going to do, it's going to leave the Palestinians, quote unquote, more and more isolated, further up a tree without a ladder to climb down. And it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. I don't know the answers. I don't. And like I say, I think ultimately the answer is going to have to come through the arrival of the Mashiach to solve all these problems. Now, before we conclude this series, I just want to make two macro observances. The first one about Israel, and then one about the Jewish world at large. That at the time of the founding of the State of Israel, the secular were convinced that the religious would go away. In other words, Ben Gurion and all his allies were completely secular, and they were in many ways socialist, and they thought that we've had to deal with these religious rabbis and leaders for so long, let's just forget about them. But Ben Gurion's idea was that, okay, you know what? Give them one generation and it'll all go away. And so at the time of the founding of the state, a certain amount of concessions are made to the religious community, even though at that point the religious community was very, very small. And the idea was what was called the status quo. And that was that all public events would be kosher, all government establishments, including the IDF, would be kosher. The buses that did not run on Shabbos would continue to not run on Shabbos. That would be throughout the whole country, except for Haifa, which was always an exception. And Haifa was one of the biggest communist bastions in Israel at that time, and their buses ran on Shabbos. So until today, the buses in Haifa run on Shabbos. The idea that there'd be independent religious schools sponsored by the government. The idea that yeshiva students would be able to defer. Now, by the way, that's no different than any other army in the world. And when there's been a draft in America, religious seminary students could defer the draft. And in Israel, the religious seminary students can defer the draft. Now, when Ben-Gurion made that law, there were less than 50 yeshiva students who took the deferment in the whole state of Israel. Today, there's like 40,000. So it's when he made all these concessions, and many of the left did not approve, and they said to Ben-Gurion, "How could you do this?" And Ben-Gurion said, "Just wait a generation. They'll all be gone, and these laws will be gone with it." Well, the exact opposite has happened. The religious community in Israel has just flourished, really become a force to reckon with in many ways, and unfortunately, that's led to friction because these status quo laws that were put on the books that Ben-Gurion thought was just a way to punt on a problem. Well, he misjudged the problem because, the religious community is stronger than ever in Israel. And really, the religious said the same thing to a certain extent about the secular. They said, just wait a generation. We'll influence them all. They'll all become religious. And, it never worked to force religion on anyone. That was never a way to get people to want to grow in their Jewish observance. So it's led to a certain stalemate in the state of Israel, as we're seeing with this recent government that's coming into power, where the religious is very much part of the government and wants certain things to happen, and the net result is just a lot of friction between the religious and the non-religious in the state of Israel. But it's interesting just to point out that the source of the problem was that Ben-Gurion really thought, and the Labor Party and the founder of the state really thought that the religious weren't going to be here in one generation. That in one generation, the secular Israelis would influence the children of all the religious, they'd all become secular Israelis, and that, thank God, just did not happen. But it's led to a friction in the state of Israel today, which unfortunately has to be dealt with. Now, if we look at the Jewish world as a whole, in 1939, at the onset of World War II, there were roughly 19 million Jews in the world. And that's probably the highest population of world Jewry ever, right? I don't think we've ever had more than 19 million Jews in the world, and that's where we were in the year 1939. Now, today, in 2022, the sunset of 2022 going into 2023, we have maybe 14 million Jews in the world. Now, think about this for a minute. That means that, so Hitler obviously wiped out 6 million. So after World War II, you have about 13 million Jews in the world. That means from 1945 until 2022, you've only gained 1 million Jews in the world. That's not good, right? That's not good in a time when life expectancy is 85 years old and we have all the technical advancements in medicine, et cetera, et cetera. It's, we have that in 80 years, we've barely increased. And at the same time, if we look at the situation, there's no Jews left in Eastern Europe for the most part, with the exception maybe 1 million in Russia. And there's... And if we look at that number, that original 19 million before World War II, there are maybe 500,000 in Israel. So there are 18.5 million Jews in the diaspora before World War II. Today, we have about 7.5 million Jews in Israel and 7.5 million Jews in the diaspora. So you have 500,000 in Israel became 7.5 million. Again, that is because a number after World War II went to Israel from the refugees from World War II. The Sephardic, the Mizrahi Jews are kicked out of the Arab countries. But again, that's the 500,000 has become 7.5 million in Israel, whereas at the same time you have about 12.5 million Jews in the diaspora, and that's down to 7 million Jews. Now that's not that's not very promising for our future. Now, how did this happen? Well, as the Jews grew in America with the large influx of Jews from 1880 to 1920, well, initially the Jews really could only assimilate so much into America because the non-Jews wouldn't let them. You had a situation where Jews weren't allowed to become doctors, Jews weren't allowed to join law firms, you had an academia, you had quotas within universities, and no right-minded WASP father would let his daughter marry a Jew, right? There was no intermarriage because the Goyim wouldn't allow intermarriage. But after World War II, anti-Semitism was no longer okay. You couldn't have these quotas anymore. You couldn't have, the quotas in universities. You couldn't keep Jews out of your law firms. You couldn't keep Jews out of your hospitals as doctors. It didn't work anymore after World War II. The world sort of came to its senses about anti-Semitism. But the net result of that was you had now Jews going to any university they wanted. And unfortunately, and I hate to say this, a university is a great place to go to learn how to hate being Jewish and how to hate Israel. And it's a great place to go to learn that there's no difference between a Jew and a non-Jew. And the net result is that in America today, we see a 60 to 70% intermarriage rate. And the net result of that is that 12.5 million diaspora Jews in 1945 is now just 7.5 million. And mark my word, within another generation or two, it's not going to exist anymore. And therefore, this is an interesting conversation to have here on the Yontiv of Hanukkah. Now tonight is the fourth night of Hanukkah, and I'm giving this lecture. Hopefully you're watching it during Hanukkah. If not, you're watching it after Hanukkah. But Hanukkah is an interesting situation. That you had a war that was essentially a civil war between the Jews who remained true to traditional Judaism and the Hellenized Jews, the Jews that had become Greek assimilated. And the situation was such that the traditional Jews really couldn't maintain the status quo. They had come to a certain accommodation with themselves. They learned how to hide and still practice Judaism, even though the Greeks had made observance of Judaism essentially illegal in Israel. But they came to an accommodation. They had figured it out, as we usually do throughout world history. But the problem was those traditional Jews looked and they saw myriads of their brothers, sisters, cousins, former roommates that had become influenced by Greek Hellenism, and they said, we have to do something about this. It's not okay that we stand here in a cave and continue to practice Judaism while they're out there worshiping Zeus, while the temple lays fallow with a statue of Zeus. This is not okay. This is a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God on a tremendous level. It is not okay. So therefore, they fought a war for that purpose and that purpose only, to say not that they only cared about themselves, they had figured it all out. But they cared about the Jews that were being influenced by the Greeks. So as those of us who take time to study Torah, who take time to study Jewish history, and we look at a Jewish world just in the diaspora that is dwindling, and dwindling for no other reason that unfortunately the majority of those 7.5 million Jews really don't care about being Jewish. They don't care to learn Jewish history. They don't care to learn Torah. And here on the Yontiv of Hanukkah, we have to say that roughly 2,200 years ago, we had our antecedents, the Maccabees, who looked at the situation, very similar situation that we're in today, and said it's not okay to stand by and do nothing. Therefore, we have to stand up and do something about the world Jewish plight. And I think that on Hanukkah, we should look at the menorah and look at the situation and say, we're not going to stand by anymore and say, okay, we figured it out for ourselves. We have our Torah anytime. We have our shul. We have our kollel. We have our place. We're happy. Our kids are Jewish. Our grandkids are Jewish. We're okay. We're okay. But millions of our brothers and sisters are not okay. And in the year 139 before the Common Era, the Maccabees looked at a very similar situation and said, it's not okay to say that we're okay, but they're not okay. So as we look at the menorah, let's make that commitment to get up and say that if our brothers and sisters are not okay, we are not okay. And maybe if we collectively do that, that 7.5 million diaspora Jews will grow to 8.5 million, and 9.5 million, and 10.5 million, so that when Mashiach Tzidkenu comes and we have the true redemption of the Jewish people, and we all join together in the land of Israel, we'll be a community of 30, 40, 50, 100 million Jews observing the Torah of Hashem, committed to our people, and loving being a member of the Jewish community. And I look forward to being a part of it with you, and let's make the commitment to make it happen on Hanukkah. And I want to thank you all for participating over these past 77 weeks in the Jewish Destiny series. I hope that you've been inspired by these words of Jewish history as I have, and I look forward to the next chapter of the Jewish Profile, the Jewish Personality series that we will begin shortly. I can't wait to do it with you. In the meantime, I want to thank you for coming, thank you for listening, and I wish each and every single one of you a Freilichen and Lichtige Chanukah.